Welcome to the Classic D&D campaign, episode the second. This is going to be about the dungeon and the campaign. And we're starting with this as the first after what is a Classic D&D campaign. But we're starting here because the game we're talking about is called Dungeons and Dragons. There will not, I hasten to confess, be an episode called The Dragon and the Campaign. Or maybe there will. Maybe eventually I'll run out of ideas and we'll go there. But the point is, the dungeon is where the Gygaxian D&D game starts. It's when you realise, it takes from Dave Arneson this idea that, okay, well, you can play fantasy war games, including a bit where you go underground and fight monsters and get treasure. And, you measure success that way. And he creates, this much bigger game around that. And the first campaigns are just dungeon campaigns, really, that then they slip the leash and start doing lots of other things, even in the very early days. But they start as dungeon campaigns, and we'll get into that. But basically, I think talking about the intersection of when we're talking about classic D&D campaigns and the dungeon, there's a few things to talk about, and I think it'll be valuable to establish the purpose, the point, etc. of the dungeon in the context of classic D&D campaigns. Do we need to have them? What do they look like? How can they function? So we'll do this in three parts. The first is that I'm just going to apply the three pillars, which are world first, challenge oriented, player driven, are the three biggest ones. Apply those to the dungeon. Just to quickly define our terms about how the dungeon can fit into classic D&D. You could play this as a convention game, and indeed we know that was a major tournament. Games were a major form of early public D&D. But yeah, just to kind of connect the dungeon adventure and the dungeon experience to this kind of idea of classic D&D as being world first, player driven, challenge oriented. Then we're going to talk about, I think we're going to talk about how central the dungeon is, what main role, like the meta role, the meta nature of the dungeon in the context of campaigns. And we'll talk a bit about additions there because I think it will be relevant. And then finally, we're going to talk about different types of dungeons and how they fit into campaigns. And so, yes, this will not mostly be about what makes a really good dungeon. There'll be a tiny bit of how that fits into classic D&D, but it won't be mostly about dungeon design. I've done some stuff on dungeon design. I have a podcast with Prince as well on it, and we've done some reviews actually of dungeons, which might give you some of our preferences on design. But this is about the sort of stepping back. How do you want to set up a campaign? You want to start a game that's going to last for years. They're going to level up loads. The players are going to see so many things. How does the dungeon fit in? That's what we're going to do. So first, to fit these three major pillars, world first, player driven, challenge oriented. So world first means that though of course it's a game and it exists for the players, you have a concept of a world, an organic concept of a world. Not all of it is detailed out, but it has its own life. It's something which as you design it, you're designing it, what would happen if the players weren't here? That even means if you're designing it as the players, by the way, we want to go to that dungeon that you have definitely forgotten to design. And you're like, either I tell them they can't go, which is, by the way, fine sometimes to admit to your players that you're not prepped. Or you can just say, yep, you go, and you're quickly coming up with a dungeon or a wilderness expanse or whatever. You still have to be thinking, what is the way in which this would exist without the players? You create it, because that's how you create a sandbox, a place with options, is by removing your hopes for the players and what they're going to do and the kind of storyline they're going to tell, and just create an environment. And so the dungeon has to fit in to the world then. It has to be something that could be in the world. Now, that doesn't mean it can't be weird, but what I mean is it's something which has to engage with the world outside, even if it is very strange. And the biggest thing here is that I think things need to be intelligible within a setting. So the dungeon, basically, if you're like, you can get into stuff about, the dungeon is the mythic underworld, so it's very different and strange, sure. But if players have no idea what they're dealing with, and the world you set up and the dungeon, or particularly if the dungeon is so different to their own understanding of the world they're playing in, or their own human knowledge, their knowledge in our world, then it'll be much harder for them to engage with. If you describe everything in terms of non-Euclidean geometry, and you expect the players to get it, then you're going to struggle. So there's some degree to which just it has to be intelligible both at a rational, logical level, and to some degree, they need to be able to connect it to things. How can they find out more about stuff in the dungeon? If they go back and they consult a sage on the dungeon, what questions do they ask? They need to be able to parse the information and connect it to the world. Player-driven. A big thing here is they need to be real choices, things that the player can meaningfully... Player-driven in general means the players drive the campaign. It's not that there's a storyline you've written up. Well, and I'm thinking, compare World of Darkness, where you'll look at the individual story, the way that DM the guides for the storyteller to create adventures. Like, okay, you do the prologue, and you do this bit, and you do this bit, and the players might change some of the details around here, but you can always bring it back into your storyline. It's something where you're giving them an experience, and their choices are important for their characters, but they may not be important for the sake of the story necessarily. Player-driven set is the opposite. Just, okay, there's a world out there, what do you want to do? And that could be a very small world. You're in a pocket dimension that's 60 miles by 60 miles, and there's 4 dungeons and 2 villages and a dangerous forest in the north, something like that. And those are your choices. Or it can be a whole world. It can be Greyhawk, it can be Faerun, whatever. But player-driven means the players are within the context of the material you've created in your world-first approach. That's what they're doing. They get to choose. And the thing here is that in the dungeon, and this is the case for everything, but apply it to the dungeon. The dungeon is this underground, typically. It doesn't have to be. It could be a castle environment with... There's different areas, and you can go left or right, and there's the prison block with the cells, and then there's the caves that have broken through into the cellars, and there's monsters in the caves, and the bugbears who have taken over these cellars are scared of the monsters, etc. That's the kind of thing you're talking about. There's this environment with all these different things going on, but the choices have to be meaningful between things. And this isn't just you can look it up, but this isn't just the famed Quantum Ogre where you always have to do the same thing, whatever you decide. That is a case of lying to the players and faking a choice. But it's that even where there are choices, sometimes choices aren't meaningful. An example is there's a left fork and a right fork. This is an advanced Quantum Ogre. Advanced Quantum Ogres and Dragons. Left fork, right fork, and they both go round to the dragon. They're both empty, by the way. There's nothing on these forks. They're literally completely meaningless, because nothing else has changed. Even if you have stuff like Wandering Monsters, well, it's the same percentage chance in each case. It's 1 in 6, say 16%, and it's the same table. And so they could have gone the other way, and they would have had the same die roll. So they're completely meaningless. 2 empty corridors. Now you can have some slight, there's all kinds of varieties of potentially fake choice there. But I think the key thing is that the meaningful choice can be through a map with lots of different routes and options. I think that's a classic way of doing it and a good way of doing it. But those things have to be that, if you go this way, you might be able to negotiate with this tribe of critters to get through. Whereas this way, it's potentially less dangerous, but there's no one to negotiate with. You just have to fight everything. And maybe there's something where the critters want something from another area altogether. So there might be just different things you can do. There's meaningful decisions you can make. Or it can be there's actually not different routes you can take, or there's very few routes, but there are meaningful choices in terms of how you deal with the challenge ahead of you in the kind of the routes you are taking. And this is going to be more appropriate for small scale dungeons generally. But for instance, an obvious one is I'm thinking actually about a wilderness environment to put up for I put up on my blog back in the day. Lord Gladhand's Orchard. But do you negotiate and pay the troll, or do you fight him? And that could depend on what resources you have. It could depend on your knowledge of trolls. What if this? I realise, by the way, as I say this isn't this a Witcher 2 quest as well. The point is that you can handle it differently depending on what skills you have. Think about how video games might have companions unlock different options, but you have to have done things with those companions beforehand, or companions are mutually exclusive. You get that in Baldur's Gate, you get that in Dragon Age, whatever. The point is that to get through, you might need to have made other decisions at other times, or you might need to, though that maybe is less of a meaningful choice in the moment and more in the past, but to get through an area to the next area, there need to be things where you could pick A or B, and A or B test different qualities They test your characters and players, particularly the players, in different ways. And the players get to choose which of those is an easier challenge or a more appropriate challenge, or something they feel happier with, or that meets their other objectives. Finally, challenge-oriented. This does connect it, but this means we don't have a pre-written story to repeat. But we've got this environment with different challenges. Some are purely logical or moral. Some are quite a bit dicey. You've got a bit of luck in them. Some are very dicey. Some are combat. Some are puzzles. Some are social, in the sense that you could potentially negotiate with someone or something, or you can free some prisoners and they'll join you. The classic follower / replacement PC in Gygax's modules. But all of these challenges are in pursuit of allowing players to not just make a decision, but also to excel and get as much of the treasure out, and defeat the relevant enemies and so on, in different ways. And here's a Baldur's Gate example, Baldur's Gate 1 example of where these things can cross over. And it's not the most exciting example, but it was a moment that was really cool for me when I first played it, and gave me the sense of what could happen in a dungeon environment. The Cloakwood Mines, you can either fight your way through or whatever, or you can flood them if you work out how to do that, and you can obviate the rest of the dungeon by flooding it. And it, as I say, in game terms, it's actually not the most exciting thing ever, when you really realise what's going on. But the first time I played it, I was like, wow, that was really, I felt like there was choice and consequence, even if it didn't have many consequences beyond the dungeon itself but it meant I was reducing my risk going further down. It meant I was dealing with the whole thing, but it meant I was missing out on stuff that was further down as well. There were costs and benefits to it, and it's something you can imagine similarly. I think about Dishonored, Prey, games like that, sometimes called immersive sims, but where you could take a non-lethal run, or you could take a guns blazing run. You could sneak around doing everything and then just leave, or you could just kill everyone, basically. And I think that this idea, and of course those test different skills. Combat is a different skill in a video game or in a role-playing game to, or at least in older editions of D&D, very different set of systems to skills, where often skills are fairly limited, and sometimes just rely on you having thought out the puzzle solution, or having said we'll do this, and that avoids the trap. So yeah, the point is those are different routes. You might well bank on your magical armor and weapons, and the fact you've got you've got a 5th level cleric with you, and it's a 3rd level dungeon. He's come along to help, that kind of thing. Maybe you've made decisions that gear you towards a particular solution rather than another one, but that player-driven and challenge-oriented stuff merges. That the players have meaningful choices that involve them being allowed to kind of pick what they just prefer, what might be more fun, but also which allow them to conquer the challenge and excel, or indeed not excel, fail, die. Their characters die. Don't kill your players. So yeah, that's the kind of general principle of classic D&D big pillars, that how I describe them, applying it to the dungeon. Let's talk now about the dungeon in the context of the campaign. How central is it? So here's an important thing just to touch on, as I say, Edition Wars. This is an Edition Wars video. You could play, I think, hypothetically, a classic game, classic D&D game, classic sci-fi game. Classic Traveller is absolutely a classic adventure game, per the CAG podcast definition. You could play loads of systems as classic games, but they're going to help you more or less, and some are going to actively hinder you. If you're playing like a Powered by the Apocalypse game, you're playing. I've got one Powered by the Apocalypse game, and it's called Mashed, and it's basically about being Korean War doctors, and uses the Powered by the Apocalypse story game techniques and mechanics to help you tell a story. You're going to really struggle to have a classic adventure game of that. Let's be honest. And I think you find this with some kind of new school D&D, post D&D games, which have particular kinds of mechanics which really push you towards a slightly more story-oriented experience, where you're going to struggle to have a classic experience. So this is why lots of people who might think, I want a classic game, will head for older editions, particularly Advanced Dungeons and Dragons or Original Dungeons and Dragons, or their retro clones. Some might go for Basic or an Expert and their retro clones. but I'll give some examples of how different editions can affect things. But the point is that the dungeon is going to be more or less central depending on the mechanical support for the dungeon. And the obvious thing here is that you end up going for an older edition, and so many of the mechanics that players have access to are most obviously geared for a dungeon. And here is the example I use here, actually, I've used before, is the dwarf has the ability to find stonework traps and to detect slopes, gradients, things that, where you wouldn't realise you're moving down in the dungeon. This is an artefact. In fact, this is a very rare case of something that is possibly undertuned in Advanced Dungeons and Dragons because of the way the assumed game has changed. But when you're in a 10-level mega dungeon with 1,000 rooms, and you've got to have a lot of variety in that, because otherwise it's going to be like, oh great, there's 100 rooms of kobolds, oh great, the next one's 100 rooms of orcs. It's not going to be very fun unless there's a lot of variety in tricks and traps and things where the players have to think, okay, how do we deal with this? In Undermountain, another classic mega dungeon, big thing is gates. The fact you get pinged around via gates and via some of which are tricks, traps type, and some which you could intentionally be using. And so you could get lost in the dungeon elsewhere because of that. And so you're having your players are testing their mapping skills. They are, and by the way, this is not necessarily the ideal type of dungeon. I'm just saying this is the original type, and this applies to the dwarf. And there's lots of secret routes, and that matters for elves. For instance, with their secret door and concealed door checks. And then maybe, because of the fact that the dungeon gets more dangerous as it goes down, well, maybe you could trick players into going down without realising. And maybe there'd be a clue that they're going down, but maybe, the players might miss it, and they'll only realise when they realise they're fighting something that is like obviously tougher than them. Maybe they push on and win, and maybe they die. But the point is that the dwarf suddenly has an ability to say, yeah, this is a revolving wall trick, or we're sloping down here. And of course, if you play an AD&D campaign where you are literally never in a dungeon that uses any stonework traps or slopes or anything like that, then the dwarf is a much weaker adrenaline shot, which is how the demi-humans really work in those old editions. Much weaker adrenaline shot to the party, because those special abilities just don't apply as often. Whereas the elf, hey, you can have secret doors in mansions and indeed in trees and woods. They're going to be rarer, but the point is that you can imagine. Also, the elf has the 90 feet, 90 yard surprise benefit. So that's definitely applicable elsewhere. Whereas the dwarf, well, all their special stuff is gone apart from their poison resistance and stuff. And the elves have the sleep and charm stuff. So yes, suddenly it warps the power. Whereas in a later edition, where races there are fewer differences, that's not going to matter as much. But also the mechanics aren't pulling players as much towards the dungeon or towards the older solutions in the dungeon. And an example of this is 4th edition skill challenges. Roll a certain amount of skills, and you can use your action points, and you can use any rerolls you've got, things like that, to try to and get extra bonuses, and whatever. 5th edition, obviously, advantage. How can I get advantage to get this done? And you're trying to get like 4 successes in these skills, or before you get 3 failures. And if you do, you succeed. That pushes you towards this. The universal skill system pushes you towards that. Whereas if it's more like, okay, so so for instance, an example there were, in terms of how you might a different one. There's traps in terms of big room traps, pressure plates, javelin traps. And so the player says, I'm going to roll perception as I look down there. And yeah, you can penalise him a little bit with time. But the point is he has a way of resolving it or not. Whereas in the older game, the player can say, we're going to tap our way down, examining the walls very carefully for all the javelin stuff. You don't roll. I just allow a player to successfully detect all such room traps in that specific case. Maybe not in another case. But in that case, I would. But of course, then they have the random encounter. Their character is more fragile than in the 3rd to 5th edition version. And so the skills that apply in the dungeon and the pressure that's put on the player in the dungeon, and that's a unique thing I think about the dungeon that doesn't apply in other kinds of adventures, is the sort of minute by minute time pressure. The fact you're counting things in 1 minute and 10 minute increments. At lower levels, that's going to matter also for light. It can even matter a bit at higher levels, but the point is at lower levels, it's applying for light. The challenges are all these very small increments of time, and the players are trying to get in and out in a certain amount of game time, and everything is costing them and creating dangers for them. And the mechanics they have on their character sheets, the very few mechanics comparatively, in terms of active ones where they can roll to decide if they fix a problem, are ones that mostly apply in that environment. Amongst the thief ones, the only one that doesn't often apply in a dungeon is pickpocketing. But the rest, though they can apply elsewhere, again, and we can debate thief class design, that's not the thing here. The point is that the thief, most of those skills allow them to scout ahead extra quietly. And so the point is move silently gives them a chance to move silently, and then they still get a surprise chance as well, as long as they're being quiet, which they are. Generally, they have a surprise chance anyway if they find enemies. So they get an extra roll to try to surprise enemies. And so on and so forth. The point is that these mechanics are pushing for both the dungeon being very central, very regular and common, but also that the challenges within it, when we talk about challenge orientation, are ones which, or rather, I think the point is that they are challenges. I do not think really 4th edition plus skill challenges, 3rd edition plus D20 edition kind of roll to solve stuff. A problem there is there are very few meaningful choices about how to apply those skills. Occasionally, a really good design will come up with that. But the point is usually like, well, I guess we'll just use the best one we've got. We'll work out a way to, if the DM is really good and balanced, we'll come up with really good ideas about how to get advantage. or we use our action points, or we use our rerolls, or luck points, whatever the systems have, to try to maximize our successes. And there might be some small choices, but basically it's something where the major gates in the dungeon are either you just roll enough dice to succeed at skill challenges where the way to do it is trivial. If you have the skill, you can try to succeed or not. Or they're combat, which is the other part of the game. Whereas the classic one is going to be a lot more about what is the appropriate skill to use here in this environment. How do we work out this environment? Are there any clues around to tell us what risks do we want to take in terms of adding time on, and in terms of because I'd say particularly at low levels that example of light matters. There are high level equivalents, but because light is a 1st level spell and your cleric doesn't have loads of 1st level spells, whereas if light is a cantrip, then that's trivial. So yeah, you get the point is that all these things are creating different decision points and making the dungeon a lot more interesting and differently interesting to anywhere else. Whereas in mechanical terms, whereas I think in later editions, a lot of these environments are going to begin to merge into one in terms of how players solve stuff. Even, by the way, the social stuff, you've got the reaction roll, that's passive. The DM does it, your stat does matter, potentially, but the point is the DM does it. But the good DM is very rarely going to use potentially, their secret reaction roll unless it's very extreme to determine the whole encounter. And instead play a decision. They can't say, can I roll persuasion to make him like me? But instead they can be like, what do you want? Can we help you? Can we do something that lets us get through? And it becomes it becomes basically more like diplomacy than like Monopoly. And by that I mean both of those ruin all your friendships and relationships, so you can take that for granted. So yes, I think how central the dungeon is depends on the edition, and how interesting the dungeon is depends on edition, and how it's going to fit those pillars depends on edition, partly. So yes, I give that just as a bit of an added discussion when we think about it, because some people, I think when you're thinking, how am I going to run a dungeon, or why does the dungeon matter? It depends what edition you're playing. I think, to put it more neutrally, I obviously have a preference here for classic D&D play, older editions. But the point is that if you're running a later edition, you're a lot less tied to the traditional dungeon, because actually it doesn't do very much for your characters. Because it's not very, you can come up with some cool ideas, but mechanically things are going to be very similar to elsewhere if you're just running by the book. And the way that players solve things isn't going to be any, particularly challenge oriented. Usually, unless it's combat, in which case they may have more interesting decisions, because later editions tend to put a lot of the emphasis in decisions onto combat. So finally, we'll talk about, and this is maybe in a sense, the most practical thing but 3 scales of dungeon. I'm going to talk about, well, 4 scales of dungeon, let's call it, and how they fit into the campaign, and essentially kind of how some of these pillars interact with the size of the dungeon that you're putting in a campaign. So the first size we'll talk about, we've mentioned it, is the mega dungeon. These are actually two box sets equivalents of Undermountain. The first one is kind of by agreement, the second isn't, and there were some extra books. Undermountain was his mega dungeon. Really interesting, very flawed product, by the way. I have to review it sometime. Undermountain was his big, great Castle Greyhawk, Castle Blackmoor kind of environment. And his first big campaign was it based in Waterdeep, and they just went into Undermountain. And you see the development in early years in relatively positive terms, I guess, in terms both in these campaigns, Greyhawk or Undermountain, that they start there and then they also begin to include other things. You get an interesting thing with Blackmoor that Dave Arneson is like, no, don't go into the stupid dungeon. That was just kind of side jaunt. Now, please come out and do all the stuff on the surface. But the point is that the mega dungeon is this massive environment that was originally really, the assumption was at some level it's the whole campaign. You read the DMG, the first edition DMG guide to starting your campaign, and even there it's sort of suggested that, like, hey, you're going to have a big dungeon and the player's going to go in week after week, and they're going to go down and gradually level up. And we have encounter tables for the levels of the dungeon, which of course, so when you look at the kind of encounter levels for levels 1 to 10 of the dungeon in the DMG, which come before the much more used, I suspect, not that the monster tables are bad, but much more used random wilderness encounters in Appendix C. You have all your kind of wilderness encounters, but before that, you have your monster encounters. Monster level 7. It could be a black pudding, a chimera, a succubus, a groaning spirit, a lamia, a mind flayer, a zorn. You get the idea. Those are there. You could say, well, they're just useful for all dungeons, but why are there 10 levels, and why is the level why is it the same word as the level for characters? That's confusing. Why not call them different things? And the point is, because of course the first level character is fighting on the first level of the dungeon on average, and the third level one is on the third, and so on and so forth. Anyway, that's a sort of simplification. But the point is, this is where it starts, and even up to the 1E DMG, there's some implication that's what's going to happen. Actually, this style of play changed, declined, expanded early on. It doesn't mean those early campaigns weren't pretty rich, massive, and successful, but it's something that the game moved not away from them, but beyond them, as it expanded to other options as well. And I think there are reasons for that. But the point is, in the mega dungeon is the whole campaign, really. Potentially up to quite high levels. You could be into the teens. If you look at Castle Greyhawk and the way it seems to run, your characters could be hitting their teen levels there. And that was, there were areas like that where the limitations of that format were felt. But the point is that, yes, what happens is you go to the mega dungeon, and in Greyhawk or in Waterdeep, you're in a city, and then you go to the next door mega dungeon. Castle Greyhawk is just outside the city of Greyhawk. Undermountain is inside Waterdeep, and classic entrance is via a pub, which has an entrance right at the top of the complex. And you just do that week after week. And a game, a 1990s war game, kind of role-playing game, I've reviewed on the channel, Warhammer Quest, the classic edition, has a base assumption of the same, albeit on smaller dungeons. Typically that, as in there, a lot of them are designed to be 3 levels or 5 levels with a set number of rooms each. But the point is, you go to the settlement, and there's some crazy randomization in that case, but then you go back to the dungeon. And you go into the dungeon and you fight some monsters, and you get the treasure you can, and you leave, and you go and level up, and then you go back to the dungeon, because the game is about that. It's not about like, which factions do I align with, or how do I create a domain, or maybe that will be more interesting. Now the choices are all within the mega dungeon. Do we go in this way or this way? Look, we'd found the secret entrance to the sub-level, but the sub-level seems pretty dangerous. Do we go there? Yeah, no, we could, but we could also go and negotiate with those gnolls that were like being influenced by the magical stones, so they were more rational. We could try to negotiate with them to work our way down the dungeon through their base. Oh yeah, maybe we could. Like, those are the kinds of options in the mega dungeon, right? That's where player choice is coming in, and the challenges are going to be, I described this a bit under the edition stuff, you're going to have an enormous variety of things in the dungeon, rather than like, well, the variety is between this kind of adventure and this kind of adventure, or between, as in there's robots in this dungeon and there's orcs in this dungeon. Actually, you're talking about a variety of fairly finely graded puzzles. Puzzles, tricks, traps, puzzles, challenges. Some of it is combat. There's plenty of combat, but the environment is so big it can't. It's going to be very boring if it's really all combat. The point is, there's got to be areas where you're like, oh, this is obviously a puzzle. How do we solve this? What might be behind it? Maybe we have to come back to it. We've accidentally gone down from the second level to the fourth level via a ramp. If only we'd brought our dwarf. All these finely graded challenges and a massive variety thereof. So I think that's the sort of the way the mega dungeon fits in, as obviously being the whole campaign nearly, with very little. You see Stonehell as a modern example, which I've reviewed on the channel and have a lot of time for. Stonehell is I've not run. Running on the mountain now, but Stonehell I've not run. But it does have these kind of like side adventures, and it has like, here's a little bit around the area of the mega dungeon. Barrow Maze has the surface areas to the mega dungeon, the surface crypts. And there can be some variety basically, but more or less the whole thing is at the site of the mega dungeon, and you're going to be going in and out, and those things in terms of it's world first because it fits in, it's something which fits into the legend of that area, and it's intelligible in respect of that. You can get information from people on the surface. It's usually legendary to that area. Undermountain and Greyhawk are like that, certainly Castle Greyhawk. And the player choice is not between places, but which route, which area within this massive complex. And the challenges are kind of enormous, finely graded, a massive variety of dungeon puzzle, dungeon tricks, traps, puzzles, etc. The second size to talk about is, we'll call it the normal dungeon. I should have the normal dungeon. I have one of 3 examples, one of which I do have the physical copy behind me somewhere. Castles Interland, T1 to 4, Temple of Elemental Evil, Under Ilafan, N5. Could be 80 rooms, could be a couple of hundred rooms. Basically you get these mid-sized dungeons, and by mid they're quite large. They have multiple levels, they have lots of things going on, but basically there's a lot of stuff in there. And whereas you can imagine logically the smallest dungeons are going to be a few sessions or just fairly quick. These are ones which could take a while to solve or get through, and maybe you dip in and out of them depending on the format of the campaign. I have a dungeon in my open table game, which is called Bowshot Caves, and the top level is caves, and there's a bunch of monsters and sub areas, and it's all kind of very cavey. There's beetles in a fungus cavern, for instance, and there were some orcs who'd moved in because the players hadn't got there particularly quickly in the campaign, and then the players found a way down to the next level, which seemed to be. It was built. It seemed to be the part of a mortuary complex with all kinds of stuff going on. Presumably still going down because they found other stairs. But they did a few expeditions there. They might go back soon, but the point is they came back out. That's something which has lots of content in it, but it's not so obviously the single tentpole of a campaign. There might be other locations. In T1 to 4, I'd say a relevant example is even within this, and I'm going to mention T1 separately within the context of this discussion. But is that there's the Temple of Elemental Evil, the upper works and the levels, but there's also the elemental nodes, which are on different planes, albeit they're reached from the temple. And there's the Moat House and Nulb, and Nulb has some implied potential dungeon environments which are not detailed here, alas. But the point is that they've got just other areas you can go to, other stuff you can do. Now, actually in T1 to 4 and in N5 Under Ilafan and in Castles Interland, particularly in Zinterland, where there's no external content really, there's just potential encounters. The point is that there's a lot of emphasis on this big dungeon or big environment. Now, that is enough to sustain a campaign. Certainly, you know, people have run many Castles into Land campaigns. By the way, these are all 3 modules I've run, and with caveats. Castles into Land is an all-time great, and these are both flawed but very. Particularly, this is very, very good but very flawed, and this is good but very flawed. So yeah, the point is that they can just be run as a campaign. But what you may often do, and what you'll as often hear as anything, is that, you know, and this is how I tend to run stuff because of the stable-based, people having multiple characters, multiple locations active in the world. You know, there might be something where players are like, okay, we'll go to that for a bit and then we'll leave. This seems too challenging for us, we'll come back later. Bowshot Caves is an example of that. The players concluded they weren't really levelled to go down a level, at least for that party. Ilafan, actually, it's the same campaign. They scouted it out and then they left because they thought, I think maybe all but one member of the party was first level, and they're like, we've scouted this out just to find out what's going on, but this is much too challenging, we need to leave. And so they have these different options. T1 to 4, in fact, because the Moat House is really a 2nd to 3rd level adventure. You could have some first level characters there. I gave the players multiple other things that they have done in and around Hommlet. As well as that, I used T0 reviewed on this channel, as well as some stuff of my own and stealing stuff from the old video game. So they have all these different options to level up with. And I think that's one of the ways you create player choice. Some people don't necessarily like that kind of player choice, given that kind of player choice. They may see it as essentially like, well, is it meaningful if players are dodging the challenge? But the point is, it's about players measuring their own risk. Now, I should say, there is a challenge when you put these multiple dungeons that players can bing between. There are a few potential problems. One is that they start going for intentionally underleveled stuff because they think, well, we'll get through it quickly. The treasure's still going to be helpful, you know, even if it's not leveling us as quickly as if we're hitting stuff on our level. If you have players who systematically do that, Gygax does actually give advice on ratioing their XP in the 1st edition DMG. But the point is that, generally speaking, I don't generally find that to be a problem, because I find that players want to explore new areas and they want to go to new places. When there's a big, exciting world with lots of things, players aren't like, oh, well, maybe I'll just farm some XP out of this kind of under-leveled content. I do not find that. I'm sure there are some people who do find that, some players who are like that. I do not find that. And so I think generally that's not going to be a problem. I think instead what you find is players try to gauge risk and sometimes will come back later, you know, to explore more. And so that normal mid-sized dungeon can be the real focus of a campaign, but it can also be something where there are many things in the world and people have heard of the legendary, you know, they may start in the village of Hommlet, which is what my Greyhawk campaign started in, or was based in, really, though there's now a party in Verbabonk. But the point is that though that's where they start, it's not where they're going to end, right? It's they could have all kinds of things they go and explore. They could and they could have heard of the famous Castles Interland in the next country, you know, in the slightly French country next door. So yes, you get the idea. Is that mid-level sized dungeon is more likely to fit into there are many options on the map, many nodes of potential action, and can fit into that kind of geographically split campaign. The final normal kind of dungeon we'll talk about is the small dungeon, which is, you know, Gelwine, Fall, and T1 Village of Hommlet I've got. Village of Hommlet was, of course, always set up to be like, oh, you can then have the Temple of Elemental Evil, and that was what, you know, everyone in 1980 was doing, was writing their own Temple of Elemental Evil to follow up from this. But the point is, it's actually a pretty small dungeon all told. The upper level has, you know, it's good sized. It has 17 locations, key locations on the top floor, and 18, is it, on the bottom floor, plus 2 areas, so 20, we'll say, because it has the 2 Ghoul sub-areas, so 20 areas, so, you know, 37. That's pretty ordinary or normal or whatever. Gelwine Fall has a slightly different thing in terms of its numbering, so it's not necessarily helpful to directly compare, but it has 7 floors, basically, and these floors usually have a couple of things going on, and there's a puzzle element because this is a puzzle dungeon. So, you know, it's that essentially there's content not very dissimilar, maybe slightly less than in T1 Village of Hommlet. But the point is that these are things where, imagine you're like, oh, well, if I'm running Undermountain, I've stolen Ed Greenwood's original Undermountain kind of key. Or actually, Gygax, though it seems like he didn't, he actually did write up the whole of Castle Greyhawk and then he hid it just as a prank and I found it. Great, that's your whole campaign. Castles Interland could do the same for quite a long time, though it's more likely to peter out, or the same with T1 to 4 or Ilafan, as players start to hit higher levels and other things you'd normally think would be necessary to engage and entertain those players. The campaign will otherwise end, which is fine if that's what you want. These are going to be a few sessions each once they're really getting going. My players have cleared out some of the T0 mini dungeons, but they haven't cleared out the Moat House. They've cleared out the top level and a chunk of the lower level, and then they had to leave. Basically, they were exhausted, and they'll be going back soon, I think, with a party. But the point is that was a few hours of play. Great. Maybe on actually I think they've done 2 expeditions, and each in terms of actual physical play was probably 3 hours, something like that. So maybe I've played 6 hours in the Moat House, 5 hours, and there's a few more hours basically. And the same with Jel Wynefall. That took a couple of sessions, a few sessions to complete. And if that's what you want to do, you're like, oh, we're just going to run this classic dungeon. You each get a 2nd level character. Let's go. Great, let's do that. But if you're thinking in the context of a campaign, then what's good to realise is that small dungeons tend to have a particular kind of purpose. I think very often you'll find dungeons that are genuinely like, 20 to 50 rooms, or weird things like 7 areas with the content of about 20 rooms or whatever. They're often low level, these small dungeons, and they often have a particular kind of job or purpose. It could just be that you're like, I've just put 10, for 1st to 3rd level, 1st to 4th level dungeons on the map, and none of them have any extra meaning other than being content. That is fine, but I think you'll often find that when you look at really good designs of these, they have the purpose of T1 is it's an experienced player's introduction to a campaign. There's bandit raids. Okay, well, we've tracked down the bandits somehow. This is obviously some of the stuff that is not very detailed in the module. And we found that there's this ruined moat house, and okay, we've got to clear it out. Okay, now we found out that there is this other temple, this cult and temple has come back. And so probably they're back in the old ruins of the Temple of Elemental Evil, so we're drawn onto that. This is a campaign opener. Under Ilafan, by the way, does this, and it shows, it may show the sign of the time, it certainly shows something, is it has 2.5 mini adventures, basically, that you do instead. Which are overland adventures, actually. There's a Caravan GT1, which I've run, and there's a Stuff's Happening in the Swamps with Lizard Men, and then there's someone gets kidnapped and you get dragged towards Ilafan by that. That's much more storyline oriented. But there's these different dungeons. An example of another dungeon is that does a similar thing is in Anomalous Subsurface Environment, which is a mega dungeon, which I've run. The first dungeon is the Mokhtar layer. That place is just like a little small place with like 7 rooms or something, and it's not even on the mountain. It's not on Mount Denethix or whatever it's called. It's just this kind of normal dungeon, and it turns out they've got some kind of radioactive stuff, and you're pointed essentially then towards the mountain, where if you then clear the top level of that, you can reopen the ASE, and the mega dungeon is reopened. So it creates this kind of this small tutorial level in that case, and also hooks you into the science fantasy main story. You're fighting kind of humanoids, fantasy humanoids, but actually it then hooks you into the main story, the main environment. So yeah, the final one, the final kind of size of dungeon, how it's going to fit into the campaign. I should say the mid-level, so the normal size dungeons, they're not going to have as many, to just loop back to that. In terms of challenges and decisions, it's not going to be about, okay, which of the many routes do we take? There might be a couple of routes, so there might be some decision making there. It's going to be, do we go there? Are we leveled to go there? Can we defeat that? Is there anything? Can we get a different mix of characters to go there? Do we need different weapons and items? And of course, you could be building dungeons across a campaign sandbox, which connect into each other like that in interesting ways. There's a key in one place that opens something in the other. the challenges are also not going to often include as much of the mega dungeon trick trap thing. You know, the ones I mentioned, I think there is a potentially tricky ramp in T1 to 4, in the Temple of Elemental Evil itself. But there's not in the others, I don't think. Generally speaking, there's going to be fewer of those. There'll be secret doors, and so that's relevant. And there'll be tricks and traps, but variety there is not, you don't need as much variety because the content is more concentrated and denser. You're not trying to say, look, here's a massive environment and almost there's a degree of procedural generation of tricks and traps to fill it. You're more like, okay, here is a strongly themed, 100 room environment with particular kinds of challenges, particular kind of factional play, whatever else. The small dungeon will typically, you definitely don't need all those tricks and traps because you might only have like a 10 room dungeon. But there's usually a really strong theme or pair of themes or something, usually one major type of enemy with a couple of minor types of enemies. Those sword dungeons often have another purpose within the context of the campaign of opening up other opportunities, providing vital information, etc. Or bluntly, in some cases, providing leveling material prior to high-level stuff that is the core of the campaign. That may not be ideal design, but that is sometimes what happens. And then the final type is the layer, and this is a micro dungeon. Is it really a dungeon? Often there are dungeons in layers inside bigger dungeons. There'll be a side room which is just some monsters. I'm thinking G1 is not a bad example of this. There is just an area with, what is it? What are the creatures that are there? Are they carrion crawlers or something else? But you just go north from the orcs and the trogs. So there are a couple of rooms worth of layers feature those types of the rebel orcs and of the trogs, and then north of that there's just some monsters who live in a place, and then there's the tunnel out from the underground area. So even within a big dungeon or a bigger dungeon, you can have, some kind of like, here's a monster layer. But the layer works. And say my Gnome Artificers Workshop, which was out back in the day on the blog. I think I linked to it from my Patreon as well. In that case, there's access to a young white dragon's lair via the escape tunnel, which is 2 areas. It's really one room with kind of 2 sub areas. The layer is quite small. There's often a couple of rooms at most, areas. And it could be part of a bigger dungeon, or it could be just generated via a random encounter. You have an encounter, you generate the chance and layer, and there they are. And I just mentioned the layer because if it's part of the point is sometimes it doesn't really have any of the other features of the dungeon dynamic where there's player choice about how to solve consecutive challenges, or choosing between challenges, or keeping a good map, or weaponizing, leveraging player character skills, based on race or magic item carry. It may well be there's none of those. It's just a little combat encounter or a negotiation. You can have layers that are very slightly more in depth, that are a few rooms. The Mokhtar layer in ASC is really a mini dungeon, but it's only really an expanded layer. It has a small band of Mokhtar spread across a few rooms with a couple of tricks and traps. It's really somewhere between the two. And so the layer is where it is not literally just procedurally generated content via wilderness random encounter. It is, I think, very often there for flavour and variety of encounter type, not of technical challenge, logical challenge, but just here's a cool different monster which we'll need to get the treasure. We'll need to work out their weird attack pattern and deal with that, or they've got magic resistance or something, whatever it might be. The point is, it just provides usually one extra bit of challenge, and that's how it fits into the larger dungeon too. Is it creates a bit of variety of challenge within the dungeon. When you're coming to sum up, then in terms of those types of dungeon in the campaign, obviously, if you're like, I'm just doing a mega dungeon campaign, well, then you need to think about the ways. In either the published one you're using, great, you can use it. If you're doing your own, how do you create enough variety over that amount of content? That also fits into the things the player characters can do, and that's true with all of these. But for the other types, it's how do they fit onto a map? How do they create different choices and routes through the campaign for the players? How, what purpose do the small dungeons and layers have in terms of what they're adding, other than just a small location with potentially not very much treasure that the players have spent their time going to? Like, what is it they are adding? What doors are they opening? What interesting challenge and treasure are they providing? So yes, that's just some thoughts on how dungeons fit into the classic D&D campaign, both in themselves as dungeons, but more how they fit into the wider shape and frame of things. But yeah, there'll be many other things I haven't said, so please do add those in the comments. And next time I might talk about how wilderness and maps work in the campaign. Till next time.